Hello, everyone. Gary here from Timeline Astrology. This is the December 2024 Sidereal forecast. First of all, let's look at the month as a sort of general outlook, and then we'll jump into each transit. There is a general sense of doom and gloom with the world on the brink, as it were. And this has begun in December with a new moon, a dark moon in Scorpio in its sign of debilitation, where the moon, the mind, the emotional state can be quite fragile. So I would just caution perhaps buying into your thinking at this time. Don't believe everything you think, as they say. The moon in Scorpio can be great in so many ways, but it just can often lead to a lot of catastrophizing that is not really helping anyone, least of all yourself. So when you look at what's happening in the world, there's a lot that you could catastrophize about, but there always is, really. It's just this month, there's so much else going on, including Mars about to station retrograde in Cancer, the moon sign, in its sign of debilitation also that, could lend itself to this kind of very reactionary, overly emotional, and very negative expectation. So again, don't buy into the spin, the hype, your own spin or hype either. The moon ends actually with the moon moving into Scorpio, conjoining Mercury once again. But that will be a very different situation because Mercury will have started to move forward again by the end of the month, and the sun will have moved into Sagittarius. And so there is a bit more of a sense of hope and optimism and light at the end of the tunnel here. So consider that from the beginning of December. As bleak as it might look right now, I think there's something more hopeful coming up. There's a lot of planetary opposition, so planets opposing each other. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It just offers a counterbalance. And the main counterbalance, really, I think, is the one between Scorpio and Taurus, as we will see a full moon in Taurus as well mid-month. And in a way, it's so extreme because it starts the month out with a new moon, a dark moon in its debilitation at its weakest point, and the mid-month period with a full moon in its exaltation point. So it's like highest of highs, lowest of lows in December. And I think it's important to recognize the balance that's needed here with, again, that sort of negative anticipation of Moon in Scorpio versus the just down to earth practical enjoyments with Moon in Taurus and conjunct Jupiter. So it's a lot more buoyant, the full moon by mid-month, which is going to appease this new lunar month, essentially, that begins on the first of the month. Again, Mars retrograde is going to add complexity all month long and really for the next few months, and especially for the first couple of months, December and January, as it's retrograde in Cancer, where although it is weak, it behaves as if it's also strong, like it's exalted almost. But the point is that it's not strong. It's not exalted. It's not at its strongest. It just feels like it might be. And in other words, if you're feeling less than in some way, or you just don't have the energy or the mojo, and then Mars goes retrograde, it might feel like you're kind of recuperating some of that energy, but you could probably, most likely, blast through all of that energy that you gained because you've been feeling less than for a while. So, in other words, if you've been feeling run down, and you feel like your energy is coming back, try not to spend it all, essentially. And at the same time, because Mars will be going retrograde, it feels more like a need to still recuperate and do things over and really think about things before doing anything and try not to push ahead all the time because the Mars retrograde is asking you to slow down and reconsider. So let's go back to the new moon in Scorpio on December 1st. Every new moon is a reset point, of course, in the month. This one in Scorpio is again a negative sort of expectation or anticipation of, again, more catastrophic world events that we could anticipate at this time, and we're likely to be. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't look at what's happening in the world and bury your head in the sand. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But it's again important to find a balance. And again, Taurus is a good balancing point if you just want to surround yourself with some support in your community, with family, with relations, with good food, even just the basics of just appreciating the things that you have in your life. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson here because This new moon in Scorpio is reminding us that when we do see what's happening in the world and we anticipate what may happen, we don't know what's going to happen, obviously, but we anticipate any kind of major catastrophic events. It's so important to recognize the things that we have in our life at this time and appreciate them more. And in a way, this new moon is a reminder of that. And it's in the middle of Scorpio in the lunar mansion called Anuradha. Radha is the wife of Lord Krishna. And essentially, it's the Vedic myth of Radha's love and devotion for Krishna. So basically, it's our own love and devotion. It's our own whatever we devote ourselves to. That's what the center of Scorpio reflects. We can, yes, get attached and we can get obsessed about it and we can become jealous and possessive and all of those other traits of Scorpio. But essentially, Anuradha is, in a way, the soft innards of Scorpio, and it doesn't have those kinds of like the sting in its tail kind of things that we think about with Scorpio, like the latter part of Scorpio has, for example, and the controlling factor of Scorpio. This is just loving and something or someone and devoting ourselves to that person. And again, it's a reminder of doing that because when things look bleak, that is also a reminder of, well, what are you devoted to? What are you devoting your energy, your time to? And is that worth it? Right? Um, because when everything looks as it is right now, quite dark with this new moon, we are reminded of how important, how fragile, first of all, life is, but how, important it is to just be present. Anuradha is associated with Saturn in the cycles of Indian astrology, the dashas. So it reminds us to just be more present. And even though it might take us out of the moment and get us to catastrophize and get us to worry about what may or may not happen and feel sad about what didn't happen, it's still a reminder. All of those are lessons in being more present with what is, what you still have in your life, whatever it is you have. So now what's complicating this, of course, is that Mercury's retrograde and right up until the full moon on December 15th. And that will then add further sort of mental spiraling, negative downward spiraling, essentially, potentially, unless we channel this in a more productive manner in terms of researching and reviewing and reassessing where are these feelings coming from? Like, why do I have this sense of dread? Why do I have any sense? What are these feelings about? It's sometimes harder to pinpoint what those are with Mercury in Scorpio, but we must dig deep and find out where those are coming from and make it more conscious. This is the opportunity for December, absolutely. And although it might be difficult, the image of a Narada is apt here, which is a symbol of the lotus flower. Anuradha's symbol is a lotus flower growing out of the mud, and it essentially reminds us that we must dig deep, in a sense, to grow up out of the murk, to grow up out of that negative thought, to grow up to lift ourselves up out of the doom and gloom, essentially. We need energy. We need to use that also, though. We don't want to avoid those feelings, but to use those feelings as a motivation in a way to rise above it all. So, in other words, with Scorpio new moon and Mercury retrograde and everything else, the sun is moving through here as well. We have this need to not ignore the murk, the darkness, the, the catastrophizing, but to use that as a fuel for your betterment, to rise above it all, to overcome the challenges that you're being faced with, which is more often than not, let's face it, a mental challenge. It's not an actual challenge always. Those people who are actually challenged and who are dealing with catastrophic events in their life don't have time, don't have the luxury to be sitting around worrying about things. They just have to do something, right? So this is the thing to remind yourself for this new moon. I want to mention about Mars later on, but first of all, the other ruler of Scorpio. So Scorpio has two rulers in Indian astrology, Mars and Ketu, the south node of the moon, the southern eclipse point. It's what makes Scorpio so hidden and so hard to pinpoint and very hard to articulate sometimes, which is why Mercury is having a bit of an issue right now. But Mercury is exchanging with Ketu, which is in Virgo, Mercury sign right now. So it could lend itself to this ability to go deeper into why we're thinking or feeling the way we're feeling. And by the way, feelings primarily drive what we're thinking, not the other way around. yes, you might be able to think your way out of a problem or think your way into a better mood, but essentially moods more so drive what you're thinking. And to be mindful of that, but also to go beyond that to Ketu, which is our core being, our still being at our center, which isn't really thinking. It's just beyond thoughts, really. And this is the potential here now as well. Now, I do want to mention a shift that's happening in December that you might not catch wind of until next year. And that is Ketu is moving backwards through Virgo right now. It moves back all the time. It's retrograde. And it's moving back into the beginning of Virgo, where we see the lunar mansion called Uttara, the latter Falguni, fruitful one. So the latter fruitful one. Essentially, this is a lunar mansion at the beginning of Virgo, but at the end of Leo. So it bridges both Leo and Virgo. It's essentially what gives us the fruits of our labors, in a sense, or whatever we've been gifted in life. This is where, in Virgo's stage at least, we start dividing it all up. Now, Ketu moving in here, as Ketu always does in a more practical way, apart from the more spiritually orientated stillness that we can experience, there is the practical issue of negating something, of reducing something, of maybe even completely removing something from our lives. And this is a story of eventually the removal of those in power who don't have everyone's interest at heart, essentially. Again, that's the bridge between Leo and Virgo. Leo is about the powerful people. Virgo is about dividing up the spoils. And, I'm alluding to a certain situation, of course, in politics. You can think about it or not. You can think about your own life, how this may pertain to your own life. But essentially, it's about a leader dividing up things. This Ketu transit through this lunar mansion back into Leo by next May 2025 and the subsequent transit in Leo from May 2025 until November 2026 highlights an issue here because Ketu removes these people, the leaders. And we're likely to see the beginning of that from December, again, subtly at first, I would imagine. So let me talk about Venus before we get to Mars. Mars is opposite in Cancer. Venus is in Capricorn and will conjoin Pluto. So it's this Mars-Pluto-Venus opposition. And Venus conjoins Pluto by December 7th, and then Mars opposes it by December 12th. Venus, of course, in Capricorn is in a friendly space otherwise, even though it's having to deal with Pluto and then the opposition of Mars. So there's a few triggers here for sure, some power struggles that we have to deal with in our relationships. But we must keep an eye on the bigger picture here because Venus in Capricorn is all about the long-term plan, is all about Saturn. And that is probably going to be a better time. It's not necessarily the best time for like just instant gratification and think that, oh, let's just soothe ourselves with whatever pleasure we can grab and, not think about these things. There are things to think about. There are issues at hand, including the Mars and Cancer opposite, which I'll talk about now, and also the Pluto, which is very triggering, and Pluto in Capricorn, which triggers all of these fears about things just falling apart in the world, which in a way they have to. But Venus with Pluto in Capricorn is suggesting that we might get more triggered now at this point in December. And so we need to be, again, mindful of this kind of negative doom and gloom anticipation that we could easily spiral into. So Mars retrograde, it's retrograde from December 6th this year until February 24th next year. It does so mostly in Cancer. And then we'll go back by January 21st to Gemini and then finish out its retrograde in February in Gemini. But it's beginning in Cancer, and that's really complicated because Cancer is Mars's sign of debilitation, and then it's weak. So we're very reactionary and not really feeling it, or we're feeling a lack of motivation or just mojo to do something. And feelings override our ability to just do something. Or if we don't have energy, then we end up with no willpower, and then we cannot help but do that very thing that we know we shouldn't do. So that's an issue, of course, Mars and Cancer. But then it goes retrograde. And then it's like, okay, now it's regaining some power when it's retrograde. But it's not going forward. It's not straightforward. It has to express itself in a sort of twisted way. And we have to find a way of getting our energy out, of getting our angst out, our anger out as well, our frustration out in a healthy way, if especially we don't feel like things are moving forward, which they are not likely to in relation to Mars type issues at this time. Now, that could be so many things in the world. on the world stage, we see, of course, Mars representing soldiers, retrograde pulling back, all of those kinds of things. But at the same time, again, it's this intensification of Mars, which could also lead to escalation in wars. So that's another issue. But personally, we have to be mindful of being triggered and reacting very strongly and maybe overreacting to a perceived threat that actually isn't real. That's another key issue because Mars here in Cancer has been aspected or looked at by the rogue that is Rahu, the north node of the moon in Pisces, that is basically hoodwinking us all and making us believe certain things that aren't true. And then when you can get somebody to believe something that isn't true, you can really trigger them to act in ways that they wouldn't ordinarily. So that's something we all have to be mindful of in general. But again, blow this out into world events and you can see how this is playing out. Then the full moon occurs on December 15th. And this is again, it's like highest of highs, lowest of lows. This is the highest of highs in a sense because it's a full moon, which is a bright moon, a strong moon, exalted in Taurus, its strongest position with Jupiter. So it's very buoyant. It's almost like over the top buoyant. And it's a great counterbalance, though, in this dark month, starting out with that new moon in Scorpio. It's in Mrigashirsha. If you ever practice yoga, you ever went to a yoga class, you probably heard the phrase Shirshasana, which is headstand. So Shirsha is head, Mrig is deer, so it's deer head. What does that mean? Well, basically, it's a lunar mansion that bridges both Taurus and Gemini. It's split evenly between the two. And its symbol is the deer head with the antlers. And that is a symbol, basically, of how the mind can go off on all these different tangents. And it's very enjoyable in many ways. And just like a deer roaming about, just curiously and innocently wondering about different things. That's all well and good. But just as the mind, as it goes off on tangents, can, and just if you let it just roam freely, can end up in some really dark corners. And so we have to be mindful of that, of reining it in somewhat. And I don't want to be a party pooper here because I do think this is a very positive full moon. It's very buoyant and optimistic and fun. But if you again overindulge, because the other thing about Mrigashirsha, it's ruled by Soma, which is a link to kind of intoxicants and taking things to feel good. Obviously, the pitfall of this would be overindulging because you don't feel good and then feeling worse, essentially. So just be mindful of the other side, the other extreme of this full moon, I would say. Then we have the sun on the same day, later on the same day as the full moon, move into Sagittarius. So the sun until this point is in Scorpio, the very edge of Scorpio, and then it moves to Sagittarius mid-December. So that is in a way kind of detracting away from the full moon phase, which again is buoyant, is optimistic, but it's like it's on edge. It's literally on the edge of signs. So again, if you're feeling yourself on edge, try and notice that feeling as opposed to just indulging and try and blunt that thing out because there is something important here to tune into. But then when the sun moves into Sagittarius, it is in a more positive place. And in a way, you know this yourself, when you do dwell on some things or you feel some things deeply, and it might be hurtful or it might be hard to sit with, when you do sit with it and you feel it out and you go through it, you know that you feel better afterwards. And actually, you feel better that way than if you were to just try and ignore it and then like have a drink or do something that just numbs it, right? It's better to actually feel our feelings essentially, and then we feel better. And this is what this sun transit in Sagittarius might suggest. So it's more cheerful generally, and it coincides, of course, with this time of year for everybody who, for most people who typically don't go to a church all year, this is maybe the one and only time they would go to church around Christmas. So it is obviously about ceremony, about religious ceremony. That's what Sagittarius is all about. It's about formality in a sense, but it's also about travel and opening one's mind and, opening our minds to beyond the Scorpio fear and dread to something more hopeful, to something beyond this life even. And of course, just the festive season itself and Santa Claus and all of that kind of jolly kind of vibe, essentially. That's the sun in Sagittarius. Mercury then, on the same day as the sun moves and on the full moon day, stations direct. That's why this full moon is quite intense on the December 15th. So just to be mindful of that. But this is obviously more positive in a sense because Mercury is now stationing to go direct. And so there's this anticipation of things moving forward. And so we can start to gather forth. And, after all the research and review that we've done for the last few weeks, all that really digging deep and trying to figure out why am I feeling this way or what's that based on, then it can move forward. Then you can start to think clearly, and then, or as clear as Mercury and Scorpio can be at least, and then move forward with your plans. So, yeah, you still have to be mindful of any kind of fear-based plans or communications with yourself or anyone else at this time, because again, Mercury and Scorpio can be more negative. So if you're planning, consider that, and especially leading into the new year, because Mercury won't go into Sagittarius until the new year. So, maybe it's a better time to maybe put off those New Year's resolutions until the new year itself. Try not to have any negative anticipation about a year that has not begun yet. And then finally, I just want to mention the Saturn square to Jupiter. This is the second of three squares. And although Vedic astrologers don't pay a lot of heed to Saturn's square aspect, it is there. It is a strong aspect. It's not as strong as its third house aspect or its seventh or 10th, but it's square to the fourth from it. And its aspect on Jupiter, therefore, is strong. And therefore, in December, and its exact square is on December 24th. So at Christmas time, be mindful of this practical need to contain something, to hold something, to give space to something, to give it a sort of, a frame, a picture, has a frame, right? Our own ideals in our own mind's eye need a framework, need a kind of structure and a system to be able to be implemented. So this is suggesting that we have to be practical and pragmatic about our ideals at this time, whether this is more kind of economic issues in the world at large, kind of restraint in another way, or not, I don't know. But it certainly is a kind of testing phase in a way when we have a square between Saturn and Jupiter that we all have to be mindful of. You don't want to be too doubting of, what you're doing, but you want to question what you're doing and if it's realistic. And again, while also giving it a framework that you can work with and a systems approach in a way to kind of make that thing a reality, essentially. So that is December. I just want to mention a couple of things coming up that I have a magazine coming out I want to mention, and I'm about to release the sign-based forecast for 2025, which are free for patrons, which you can purchase on my Patreon page. So you can go to timelineastrology.com and find the links there. I also have a Scorpio audio club, which I share a lot more content with patrons, including a mid-month update, a more in-depth study of the transits of the month in a sense, because the sun moves mid-month. And then we also have a monthly discussion and so much more. But this is the magazine that I'm going to launch on December 1st at 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, Universal Time. And I'm launching it for patrons initially. It will be launched for the public on January 1st. So if you want to grab your copy early, sign up as a patron. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial if you wish, or you can sign up for a month. It's just $5. And I think there's even like a 20% discount at the moment. So that is December 1st at 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. If you sign up, you'll get the links. And then finally, I just want to mention this 2025 timeline report. So I'm going to go through each month and look at the main transits for each month in 2025, so all of 2025. And then I'm also going to share a calendar with everyone who attends and for all patrons, where it's basically a guide to the year. So this is apart from the magazine. This is a calendar which goes through all of the major sidereal transits and then gives you sort of ways of working with these transits and a sort of review of each transit each month and the main flavors of the month. So consider signing up. And finally, they are the signs this is the most important thing really for you, because everything I've said thus far is all sort of general astrology for the world, for everybody at the same time. But if you would like to know your own sign, your sidereal sign, or your moon sign, you can sign up at patreon.com/timeline astrology and get your sign report. Each recording is an hour long. And like I said, it's free for patrons. But if you would like to purchase one, you can go to the Patreon store. So you go to patreon.com/timeline astrology and you can see the shop there and you can purchase your sign. Okay, that is it, folks. Thank you so much for listening to this all the way through to the end. I hope you got something from that. Wishing you all the best for the month ahead, and I'll speak to you in the new year.